This story's climax will be how thrilling. Is the final showdown to determine fate? Or can the protagonist overcome inner struggles? Or can the protagonist save everything? Dive into the world of genetically modified werewolves. Subscribe. Chapter 27. Rock, paper and scissors on who talks to him. Nolan said with an awkward chuckle. Ryan shot him a glare and then turned his head back to his friend. Slade found refuge deep in the woods, far away from everyone. He hated to see him that way. Hated seeing him hunched over with his head in his hands. Like everything was over. He couldn't blame him, though. Slade was in no position to keep up the alpha act. Ryan and Nolan already knew that the moment 9 was kidnapped, Slade was just hanging on. Their friend was forced to be strong for the pack. He could not be selfish. Not when so many other lives depended on his guidance. It made Ryan appreciate his position as beater. There was no way he could stay sane. Tori was gone. The craving for her and constant thought of his mate would drive him mad. But for Slade, now he faced the consequence. He really believed in her, didn't he? Nolan said as he stared at his alpha solemnly. Ryan sighed. He did. We all believed in 9. He couldn't help but let out a short laugh. 9 was the strongest of us all. She was the perfect match for Slade. You know, I was truly proud to be under their command. To follow our Alpha and Luna, I truly felt we could become better with them leading us. But now. Don't. Nolan abruptly cut in, and equally shutting Ryan's depressing speech. The beater was stunned when he turned to look at the Omega. His eyes were burning intensely as he gazed at the beater. Don't talk about 9 as if she is dead. Don't talk about Slade as if he cannot be our Alpha anymore. Nolan said seriously. Ryan stuttered in shock and then clenched his teeth in silent frustration. His fists curled tightly and shoulders hunched. Sorry. I just hate how helpless we are. Our Alpha and Luna are in trouble, and yet we can do nothing. He growled out. Ryan flinched when Nolan placed a hand on his shoulder, as if he forgot he was there. This was where Nolan played his role as the Omega. The one that kept the peace. The one that brought hope even in the darkest of times. It's not over yet. He squeezed Ryan's shoulder and kept a steady gaze. We'll keep fighting until the end. Don't give up, don't stop moving. Otherwise we'll all die. That felt like a punch in the gut. Ryan took a deep breath and nodded in thanks to Nolan. Do you think he is calm enough? Asked Nolan while staring at Slade, who seemed motionless. Lighting rubbing the bump at the back of his head, Nolan winced at the memory of Slade going berserk. Something set him off, but it was clear that Slade could no longer control himself, as he thrashed out at everyone that got close to him. Many of the warriors had to aid to bring him down. Nolan and a few other warriors were not as lucky, as Slade clearly sent them flying across the room. The force broke a few bones and created a lot of bruising and bumps. The surveillance room was almost destroyed. Thankfully Slade's wolf stepped in. Though it was sad to think that even Slade's wolf gave up on his mate. Let's just go. Ryan said, breaking the Omega's thoughts. We still have to report the news to Slade. No point in wasting time. Together the pair walked towards their glum friend. Sitting on either side of Slade, the two looked at each other, and with their eyes they silently communicated on who would speak first. The dejected sigh that left Slade's lips caused Ryan and Nolan to freeze. What? Voice unrecognizable and blank, Slade dropped his hands and just stared at the ground. His normally bright green eyes were so dark, it was as if there wasn't even a soul in the body. Clearing his throat, Ryan decided to man up and speak. We have just been informed that Alpha Jack's pack. Gulping, the beater muttered out the words, has been massacred. Slade snapped his head so quick that it frightened Ryan. What? The Alpha stuttered in confusion. Alpha Jack. He was with Mason when he found 9 at the arena. Looking at the ground, Ryan told Slade what the council had been informed a mere 15 minutes ago. Nothing could be done to save the pack, nor could anyone have done anything to stop it. Especially since no one saw it coming. 15 minutes ago, we got a call from an outside line. It was Alpha Jack. Ryan's eyes could not meet Slade's eyes. He told us that his pack had been massacred. No one but him survived. Ryan was not looking forward to saying the next part, so Nolan stepped in. It was Victor. Slade turned towards the Omega. Nolan, without fear, held his Alpha's intense gaze. The council sent out warriors to his pack and to pick up the Alpha. In about an hour the Alpha will arrive to give us the details, but the one thing that he did say was, Nolan licked his dry lips and said clearly. You should have killed that she-wolf when you had the chance. Slade slammed the door open and it ricocheted off the walls, almost breaking in the process. Is he here? His voice boomed loudly, energy emitted from his body causing the lower werewolves to look down in submission. Tian, who held back a flinch from the silently fuming Alpha, answered him calmly. No. But Alpha Jack is to arrive in about 10 minutes or so. Until then please calm yourself and refrain from destroying other things. He said while keeping a strong gaze on the Alpha. Shutting his eyes, Slade knew he could not calm down. Even after he spent the hour letting off his anger in destroying anything that he could sink his claws into. Gritting his teeth tightly and opening his eyes, Slade moved to an empty chair in the corner. I'll wait right here, he said lowly. Eyes glaring at the door where he would kill the damn mutt who dared to threaten his mate. Vint, noticing the Alpha and almost reading his mind, spoke up. Careful, boy. Slade's deadly glare snapped to his. Don't release your anger on others when the real threat is Victor. Grinding his sharpened teeth, Slade bowed his and let his overgrown hair shade his burning eyes. Lately the time had been excruciating slow for Slade. Waiting for the Alpha was only making more agitated. Upon hearing footsteps, Slade shot to his feet and stared at the doorway. He could see the Alpha approaching with guards at his side. Jack ignored Slade and only kept his eyes on Tian. What happened? Tian questioned, getting straight to business. The build-up of energy welling inside of the Alpha just snapped. His attention turned to Slade where he roared ferociously and charged towards Slade. He grabbed him by his neck and slammed the furious younger Alpha against the wall. The guards reacted quickly, grabbing the arms of Jack and tried to pull the desperately angered Alpha away from Slade. My pack died because of your mate. He spat in Slade's overly calm face, but his eyes were burning intensely. My mate is dead. My family. My friends. All gone. The warriors were able to pry Alpha Jack, but his attention was solely on the one who caused his pain. You should have destroyed her. He growled without sympathy. Slade took everything he said without a word. I told you she had the mind of a killer. Now I pay the price for your mistake. Jack roughly shook off the werewolves still holding him. Slade was all too calm. But he had the eyes of a predator. She is not like us. Jack shook his head and glared. She was not meant to leave that arena alive. He spat and then pointed an accusing finger to Slade. I warned you. But you didn't listen. She is my mate. Slade growled dangerously low and prowled closer. Alpha Jack straightened his spine as he looked down at his enemy. She will kill us all. A vicious growl rang through the air, but the other warriors were upon Slade in a second. They held him back just in case he attacked, but were surprised when he didn't. Instead they watched as Slade turned around, revealing his back to the older male. That was a sign of great disrespect in the werewolf community. Jack growled, but Tian stepped in between the two alphas. What happened? He asked Alpha Jack, not wanting for a fight to break out. Snapping his eyes to the councilman, Jack told him only what he needed to know. I wasn't even supposed to live, but Victor made sure I did, and for one reason only. He said, voice turning hard. Jack glared at Slade, who listened, but did not turn around. In 9 days Victor will attack. The cause an uproar within the room. All outraged that Victor so blandly paraded his arrogance. As if saying that he did not consider them as a challenge. Alpha Jack stalked towards Slade. His steps silencing the room. All eyes were on the two alphas. The tension in the room only thickened to the point that it was suffocating. Slade peered at him over his shoulder, knowing that there was more. He also told me to relay a message to you. This made Slade turn. Whatever he was going to say, it regarded about 9. Inhaling deeply, Slade nodded to the alpha. An almost cruel, mocking smirk crawled upon Jack's face. As if he didn't care to put an ounce of sympathy into his words. Instead he bluntly spoke, and hoped that soon Slade would get a small inkling of how he felt when his family died. He wants you to see his creation. To see what he made of your mate. Slade's muscles twitched. Jack mockingly chuckled. Or should I say, what's left of her? The tables turned. Slade grabbed Jack's collar and brought him face to face. But that did not faze the man. Instead he watched intently as Slade battled within. He could clearly see the burning rage in his eyes. Maybe you'll heed this warning. Alpha Jack smirked, his own eyes darkening and voice dipping down to a whisper. He only wanted Alpha Slade to hear his words. Your mate will die. Maybe then, you'll be fortunate enough to say goodbye. That was enough. Slade roared, his muscles coiled and released as he threw Jack back. The enormous force sent him flying, where he crashed heavily into the wall behind him, causing a massive dent. Slade was about to go after the fallen male, when Tian stopped him. Outside. His voice was firm. When Slade made no move, he blocked his view of an angered alpha and spoke again. Now? Slade finally looked Tian in his eyes, but just as quickly he turned and walked away. Out in the hall and away from everyone, Slade could only pace in confusion and anger. He didn't know what to think. What's left of you, mate? What did he mean? Slade thought in frustration. His mate was not gone. 9 would not let that happen. She wouldn't. Tian placed a hand on then anxious Alpha, snapping him out of his inner turmoil. He could only gaze at him in pity. Knowing that no words could comfort him, Tian sighed. He'd hate to do this, but Alpha Slade was the only one who could make it happen. Alpha Slade. Tian spoke, his voice lacking in any sign of emotion. What he was about to ask was everything against being a werewolf. Only one look at the councilman, Slade knew what he was going to ask. He shook his head, face falling, and eyes pleading as he whispered. Please don't. He backed slowly away from the emotionless man. Fists tightened by his side, but that did not stop them from trembling. You are the only one. Tian said, watched as the man's face crumbled in defiance. I won't. Slade said strongly. The conviction in his voice was firm as he gazed back at the man. But 3 words wavered his determination. But you will. Tian took a step closer, his eyes firmly on Slade's. Slade hung his head and bit his lip hard. Terror welled in his green eyes, so he shut them as he listened. Listened as his heart broke. You are the only one who is strong enough to do it. Listened as his words pierced his soul. If what Alpha Jack said was true, then your mate is a danger to us all. The council and I have decided that there is only one way. Slade forced his eyes opened. Forced himself to look up. Forced himself to accept the command. Make no mistake, Alpha Slade, your mate will not live to see another day. Tian commanded, using his authority on the Alpha, she must die in 9 days. Which is therefore, I, Tian Grim, command you, Alpha Slade Braxton. Tian breathed in and then ended his orders. The first tear fell from a broken man. To kill your mate. Chapter 28. In 9 days Victor will attack. 9. Tian returned into the surveillance room. Slade chose to be alone, which was for the best. Tian hated to force someone to do the unthinkable. But Slade was their only hope. After hearing that the Lycan only submitted to him, he knew that Slade had the power to take the Lycan down. They would already have problems with Victor's modified rogues. Especially since they were much harder to take on than a normal rogue. Additionally, they had no clue as to how many he made. They were outnumbered and overpowered. A Lycan could destroy their very existence. And under Victor's control, Tian shook his head. Ridding of that horrid thought. The peace they have fought for would be gone. Both between human and werewolves. It was not a risk he was going to take. Tian hardened his heart. In order to protect his family and every werewolf in existence. Slade was going to have to kill his mate. 8. Since the message, everyone had been on edge and anxious about what is to come. They wasted no time in preparing strategies, recruiting warriors from other packs and training them on how to counter the new breed of rogues. The tension was intimidating. Many made sure their families were far from the fight. The goodbyes were the hardest. One that Paul, Ryan and Nolan knew all too well. There were many tears and promises to stay alive. Tori and Lillian held onto their mates as long as possible until it was time for them to leave with the other families. But there was one person who did not get the chance to say goodbye. Slade was locked away in his room. Lillian tried to at least give her son a hug, but he wouldn't open the door. The tears pained Paul, but he convinced his mate that he would be okay. There was a lot of pressure on him, and seeing his crying mother would only cause more stress. So with a heavy heart, a mother left without saying goodbye to her only son. 7. Raising his fist and hesitating for a second, Ryan plucked up the courage and knocked against the hard wood. Slade? He questioned. Lowering his hand, Ryan leaned his ear against the door, hoping to hear even a whisper or breathe of someone living inside. But there was nothing but eerie silence. If it wasn't for his scent, then Ryan would have thought Slade ran away. Sighing, he pulled back and stared at the door in sorrow. They haven't heard from their alpha ever since he had a talk with Tian. Whatever he said clearly sent Slade into lockdown. He did not answer to anyone. Did not eat. Did not leave his room. Just gave up. It was a scary thought. Everyone was relying on him. His pack looked to him for guidance. The others believed he was their way of defeating whatever Victor had in store for them. But here he is, locked away. No one dared to force him out and just left him. But even then it was worrisome. Slade, Ryan could not speak. His hands turned into fists. He didn't know how to comfort his friend. But what could he possibly do? He shut his eyes. We're still here, Slade. We'll be by your side. Opening his eyes, Ryan's will strengthened. Anything you need, we got your back, brother. 6. No. Please. The man begged. He thrashed and resisted all he could, but being held down by the silver chains, he could not escape his fate. Victor watched keenly, as one of his men grabbed the frightened rogue and injected him with his drug. The silvery blue liquid could be seen as it flowed through his veins, burning him as it surged through his body. Ah! The rogue screamed. Victor watched. Never would he be tired of watching, as the Lycan DNA changed the physiology of the werewolf body. And as much as they fought, they could not escape. But what excited him most was the way the inner wolf reacted to the DNA. It was complete submission. While the wolf allowed the transformation, the human did not. The human fought to stay in control. To stop the change. To survive. Alas, they were not powerful enough to stop their own wolf rejecting them. With the Lycan DNA and wolf both pushing the human, their soul becomes suppressed and pushed deep down into the abyss, where the soul withers away into nothing. Just like his dear number 9. Gone? Never to return. If only they had accepted the DNA. Allowed the genes to morph with the cells. Then they would have turned out like Victor. Has the strength of a Lycan, but still in control. Both he and his wolf were more powerful than the other pathetic werewolves. He would show them just how much stronger he got. Victor chuckled ominously. There was one thing that intrigued him. After he wins the war, he must research more on this realm. Where souls can be destroyed but the body stays intact. Such promise it held, his eyes gleamed. It's done, sir. The man broke Victor's thoughts. Nodding his head, Victor motioned to the rest of the chained rogues that lined up the wall. They all saw what happened. Fear and terror could be smelt in the air. Some silent, others thrashed and cursed. But they knew that with every rogue injected, they were one step closer to being one of them. Victor smirked down at them. You know what to do. 5. Tian gazed down at the map laid out before him. His eyes carefully scanning the terrain, noting where would be the best place for the fight. Having it near the town would only cause unnecessary problems. The best option was in the woods. But where? It had to be somewhere where they had the advantage. Tian knew that Victor was arrogant enough to fight wherever because he thought no one could defeat him and his army. Hard to believe, but Tian thought it might be true. His fist banged against the table, startling nearby warriors. They were already on edge. They didn't need it to be within them too. Hanging his head and sighing, Tian prayed for good news. Suddenly Vint stormed into the room. He took to stand next to the stressed councilman. Everyone has been evacuated. Warriors are ready to move on your command. Vint told him, unknowingly releasing some pent-up energy from Tian's shoulders. He nodded his head. What about Slade? He asked but knew the answer. Vint shook his head. No sound. If it wasn't for his scent, I would have thought he wasn't there. He grunted. He understood the pain coming from the Alpha, but right now they needed everyone's help. Right? Tian cleared his mind and stared at the map once more. There was an area that he was not familiar with. What's there? He asked Vint. Taking a look, Vint told him. It's a ruin on top of a rocky peak. I believe a castle of some sorts was there once, but now it's just a pile of rocks. Vint looked to Tian with a raised brow. But there is a clearing below. Only tall grass covers the land. Taking in the information, Tian straightened up. Vint could see the glint in Tian's eyes and he smirked. We'll fight there. 4. Lycan was loving the power he possessed. He thrived as time passed. In no time, he would end Victor and take full control in creating chaos and destruction upon the humans and werewolves. He chuckled darkly. Oh, how he could not wait. But first he must test out his strength, and what better way was through a war. He would see how far he could command rogues, how much he could kill and how he could make others submit to him. Lycan's body shook with anticipation. Blood eyes gleamed with glee. Claws and teeth itching to sink into something soft. Lycan tilted his head slightly to the side. Lips curled into a human-like smirk. Maybe he should spare Victor, just because he gave him a mindless army that would follow him blindly. And especially those rogues. It seemed Victor got busy while 9 was out playing a pack wolf or possibly even before that. His eyes slowly gazed at them. They lined up in separate cages. Some paced the length, others watched with careful eyes. They were shorter than him, which was for the best. Lycan would kill any who he saw as a threat. He didn't know how Victor did it, but those didn't have a human side at all. They were all wolf well almost. Lycan snickered. Standing up to his full height on two legs, he saw in the corner of his eye that the others followed his lead. Lifting his head to the moon, Lycan's dark, ominous howl rang out through the sinister night. It was followed by his rogues. His army. His pack. 3. Ryan dashed around the corner. His feet carried him through the hall toward Paul and Vint, who were deep in discussion. Both of them noticed the panicking beater. "What's wrong?" Paul asked, worriedly. He asked the beater to go check up on his son. The look on his face was clearly not good news. Ryan shook his head. "Slade's gone," he exclaimed. "We don't know where he went. No one saw him leave, not to mention he didn't tell anyone." He explained and ran a hand through his hair. Paul took immediate action. "Send a team find him." He couldn't have gotten far. Ryan was about to leave when Vince stopped him. "No. We cannot afford to go on a goose chase for someone who abandoned us. The war is in 2 days. We need to train and prepare for it," Vince said, his eyes silently warning the beater not to move even though he knew he wanted to. Paul stood in front of the councilman. His face just holding back his anger. "My son would never abandon us." His voice raising. The air tensed. The two males were lowly growling at the other. Ryan stepped in between the two, but his eyes were solely on Paul. "Sir, do I send the team?" Paul took a step back. Eyes hard as he lifted his chin. "No," he said, eyes moving to Vint, who was scowling at the old man. Glaring him down, he said to Ryan, but kept his eyes on the councilman. "Slade will come back. Just you wait." 2. Lycan. The sound of Victor's voice had the Lycan roll his eyes. "Patience," he told himself. Letting the man walk to him instead, Lycan watched him with disinterest. Victor, hating the way he gazed at him, let out a growl. "Remember who's in command." He snapped, but his anger only intensified as the Lycan lifted his head and smirked at him. "Of course, I know who's in command," Lycan said. Both knew he was talking about himself. It was the lazy smirk on Victor's face that made Lycan become on edge. The man was hiding something from him. He didn't know what, but it must be something that could control him, because Victor knew his life was to end after the war. Lycan could only wait and see. He knew nothing could possibly work on him. No alpha mark, fear or torture would control him. He was the one to be in control. No more would he follow. Victor triumphantly smirked. He saw the change in the Lycan. Good. As long as he had the small device safely tucked into his pocket, Lycan would be in his control. Oh boy, was he going to use the Lycan's power. The time was finally upon him, and he was going to enjoy every second of it. "Gather the rogues. We move tonight," he ordered the Lycan. "By tomorrow morning, he will witness his greatest creation massacre his enemies." The fun was just beginning. 1. It's time. Chapter 29 Part 1. The day had arrived. It was like fate predestined the exact day and time, adjusting the universe for this moment. They made that morning unbearably cold. No human would dare to leave the warmth of their bed to walk into the woods. Thick fog coated the air, the eerie mist creating an ominous feel. Daring any to enter and see if they can make it out without getting lost. Even though the temperature dropped below freezing, there was a large source of heat in the woods. It moved, slowly, soundlessly. Like a single wolf, the pack stalked. 300 strong. Their pace was steady as they trekked forward to the destined site. Ears twitching, but eyes unwavering as they stared forward and nowhere else. With every breath they exhale, the air turning into a cloud vaporizing in puffs of smoke. In proper werewolf hierarchy, and led by the highest council member, Tian was flanked by his comrades. Behind him came the alphas, beaters and finally the warriors. As they neared the clearing, all around the tension arose. Some shifted restlessly, others stood still. But every single wolf was on high alert. Eyes scanning the terrain. Even though they were to meet at the clearing, they could not trust Victor to keep his word. The threat of ambush was still a danger. Stop! Tian's voice rang out through the mind link connected to every wolf. As a unit they paused and waited. Tian could see the clearing just ahead. He was waiting for the warriors he sent ahead to scout for possible ambush, and to see how far the enemy was. He could already smell them, and by the stench he could tell they were in for a fight. Not a few minutes later, he could see the pair of their fastest warriors break into a run across the open field. In matters of seconds they reached him, heavily panting but far from being tired. They are almost here. Victor seems confident enough not to plant an ambush. The warrior grunted angrily. But he did not voice that he was also thankful that Victor was cocky. Otherwise, they would be walking into a bloodbath. Not like this one wouldn't be the same. Nodding his head, Tian turned his light caramel body to face his comrades. This is it. He spoke, voice high with authority and firmness. Beyond those trees stands the greatest enemy and threat for us. Then Tian's tone dipped uncharacteristically terrifying, but we will make sure that they are nothing but a bedtime story. The atmosphere suddenly shifted. The warriors gaining confidence and strength, some even letting out a howl. Facing forward, Tian walked. Head held high, chest puffed out and eyes solely locked on the tree line. His army followed suit, spreading out to show their mass amount of numbers and strength, a strategic play to intimidate the opponent. If they could just frighten even a few, it would aid them for the real threat. The Lycan. This was a fight between wolves. No weapons or human interference. It was just teeth and claws. It was a matter of pride and the survival of all werewolves that they must win. As they waited, Tian slightly turned his head towards Beta Ryan, but kept his eyes firmly on the tree line. Any news on Alpha Slade? He asked. His ears twitched in his direction, at the sound of him shuffling. No, Ryan replied, reluctantly. His head low and away from the councilman. Tian made no comment. Here they come. Vince said, alerting all wolves. From the shadows, the fog parted ways. Out walked a lone man, standing tall and proud. The unmistakable smug grin permanently etched on his face. Even after 30 years, Victor Bane did not change much. His black eyes always held a glint of maliciousness. His ambitions looked to evolve the werewolf race, to see them as the superior species. Humans be damned. The weakling did not deserve to be on top of the food chain where they could reign supreme. The result of his ideals and beliefs were exile. But now Victor returns. His creations perfected. And his intentions deadly. So we meet again, Tian. Victor said, but his voice could be heard loud and clearly through the soundless woods. Shifting. Tian stood with pride in front of what he once called friend. But now, his enemy. Stand down, Victor. He replied calmly, but in his eyes was a storm. Victor barked out a laugh. Always one to get straight to the point. He sobered, eyes scanning his pathetic army. Is this all you got? He asked as if the sight before his was a joke. The mass warriors snapped and growled at him. Victor grinned ruthlessly at the agitated werewolves. Then Victor's brows furrowed as something struck him. A side smirk curled the corner of his lips, as his nose lifted haughtily into the air. "Oh? And where is Alpha Slade?" he questioned arrogantly. "I would have thought he would be the one to challenge my creation." Tian did not answer, but he couldn't stop his eyes from narrowing. But the lack of answer angered Ryan. The fact that Tian did not defend Slade shows the lack of trust he has in him. Did he not know that everyone was depending on Slade? Did he not know that Slade is the greatest man he knows? Did he not know that Slade would never abandon them? That's the thing. He didn't know. Because he didn't believe. Ryan did not hesitate to shift to human, and stood in front of Tian as he addressed Victor. He did not care that he showed a lack of subordinate, but then again he only followed his alpha. "Careful, Victor, your pride and arrogance is going to hurt a lot more when Slade defeats you." The beta snapped, having complete faith in his alpha. Victor's smirk grew merciless. "Maybe then he'll turn out just like me, when he kills his own mate." He darkly chuckled, making Ryan bristle. "Don't worry, I've made it easy for him. If only he could be here to see what I turned his mate into." And then it happened. The air turned thick with an unfamiliar amount of pressure. Slowly building up as it came closer. "Too bad he couldn't witness my greatest creation destroy you all. To show you what a true werewolf power should be." He exclaimed and laughed nastily as his army came into view. Victor raised his arms out to the side. "Feast your eyes at my creations and your death dealers." Hairs raised on end in unease. Every one of their wolves were trying to flee. Instincts alerting them to a threat far greater than they could possibly imagine. Tian along with Ryan shifted back to their wolf form. The High Councilman taking notice of his warriors shuffling backwards unconsciously in dread and fear. "Hold your ground," he commanded. Tian did not like the power that one Lycan had over the werewolves. He needed to be taken down immediately. Lycarian coolly walked on all fours, clearly not threatened by what is ahead. His claws digging into the moist earth, leaving behind his presence. His muscles twitching with excitement, and eyes glowing bright red. The sharp fangs showing between his curled lips. Tian spotted the Lycan watching them with lethal interest. A low growl escaped at the beast. "Remember the plan. All I'll dash." But he cut short when his wide eyes saw what else followed behind the Lycan. They had more than just modified rogues to take care of. Whimpers and low yowls were emitted from his warriors. Even the fiercest of werewolves backed up alphas and betas alike. Tian could not stop his body as he too withdrew. No matter how hard he tried, his eyes could not conceal his terror. Because behind the massive Lycan was 8 other beasts just like the one leading them. Each had a crazed look in their red eyes. They snapped and bit at each other, but moved in unison behind Lycarian. Behind them the improved rogues. For now, they copied their alpha and stayed on all fours. Tian was dreading the moment that all 9 Lycans stood to their full height. Only the moon goddess could save them now. Victor gleamed as he watched them retreat. How long had he waited for this day? This would be his largest arena. With the improved Lycans and rogues, he could finally unleash his experiments and see just how powerful they were. Though it was a shame that the other 8 Lycans were only imitations from Lycarian's genetics. They were smaller than Lycarian and were created and developed from a tube. But still they possessed the Lycan's instincts and aggressiveness. When he introduced the Lycans to his first creation, Lycarian showed no mercy in proving who was the strongest among them. The brutal fight excited Victor. He watched and analyzed their raw power. One day he would be one. But to do that, he needed to get rid of the werewolves that opposed him. There was a tense standoff. It was as if time itself stopped. The world quiet, but the sounds of heavy breathing and grunts rang out loudly. Digging down, Tian forced himself to override his wolf and instincts. His steps forward were not as confident as before. His posture did not stand tall. But he had to be strong. It took one wolf to lead them all. Stay in formation. His growl snapped the warriors out of their flight. Tian's voice rang out strong and firm as he commands them. All alphas and betas will take down the Lycans. The rest will fight in pairs, creating a wall between the Lycans and the rogues. He ordered loudly through their heads, his strength seeming to pass on to each wolf. We will divide and conquer. May the moon goddess be on our side. Tian finished and then howled. 300 wolves answered the call. And then they jogged forward. Lycarian's blood ran thick through his veins as his adrenaline pumped. He watched his prey run to him, his hunter instinct begging for a fight. He was going to taint the ground permanently red. Let the fun begin. He smirked and allowed his dominance to taint the air. Wordlessly his pack knew what to do. The rogues dashed forward. No plan was needed because Lycarian did not care for their lives. For him, he was going to kill everyone in his sights, friend or foe. They were all going to die. Lycarian's dark chuckle shook his chest as he applied pressure on his legs. The Lycans watched their alpha stand to his 7-foot stature on his powerful legs. They too stood strong and waited for the command. The two armies clashed in a heated battle. For now, the strongest wolves added the warriors until the Lycans came into the fight. Lycarian was not liking that the rogues were taking away his prey. His dominance did not allow lesser wolves to have the first bite. They would pay for their disobedience. His large jaws opened wide, teeth gleaming as he released the most savage and ferocious snarl. It was deep and resonated right through every wolf in the vicinity, halting their actions. All wolves were forced to look at him, forced to watch as the Lycans charged forward with unbelievable speed and velocity. They took down anyone in their path. Lycarian laughing mercilessly as he got to the center of the fight. He did not care that Victor was not fighting. He did not care that the werewolves were separating the Lycans from the rogues. He didn't care that the Wers were able to take down 2 of the weaker Lycans. He just didn't care. Lycarian was reveling in all the blood that splattered and sprayed from ripped arteries. The sounds of pitiful cries as wolves are teared apart. The sight of unlimited prey to savagely kill. The alpha Lycan's body convulsed with hysterical laughter. The sound echoing so deeply chilling and psychotic as Lycarian lashed out in a bloodlust craze. Any wolf close to his razor-sharp teeth and claws would meet their end. He made extra sure it was excruciating as they experienced his ruthless power. But he was not satisfied. There had to be stronger wolves to fight. Lycarian's eyes scanned wildly for the leader. He barely noticed the little wolves trying to hold him down with their feeble bites. Their blood-crazed eyes locked onto the unsuspecting councilman as he was trying to take down another Lycan. The beast let out a howl, signaling the start of his hunt. His massive body muscled in, shoving all out of his way, eyes brightly gleaming with exhilaration and thrill. Tian had but a second to move. Even then he was not fast enough, as Lycarian jaws heavily clamped down on his spine. Without letting go, the Lycan snapped his back. Tian howled in pain. The reinforcement was immediate. The 3 councilmen and Beta Ryan was there to respond to their fallen comrade. Their massive wolves aimed for the alpha of all alphas. Vint and Orst went for the back legs and violently tried to pull Lycarian away from Tian. While Drac and Ryan went straight for his heavily muscled neck, shutting their jaws straight down on his jugular, and viciously thrashed their heads side to side. Now this is a fight. Lycarian released the severely wounded Tian, and turned his attention to the others. He barely took notice as a few other werewolves took Tian away. He could barely contain his excitement at the sight of a challenge. The Lycan simultaneously snapped his jaws on Drax's neck and kicked Vint in the face with his back leg. Both yelped in pain and released the flesh. Lycarian swung his head around and threw the one in his mouth at the other, amused as they collided with each other. That left two who wisely released the Lycan to regroup. The blood from his jaws dripped tauntingly to the floor as Lycarian prowled to the four who defiantly stood fiercely snapped and growled at him. His eyes gazing at each carefully, but soon pupils contracted on a familiar one. "I remember you." His voice sending a sharp pain through their heads, making them wince. But there was only one who was used to it. "You're that beater." Ryan held his ground and glared at the Lycan. Hating to see him instead of Nine. Lycarian looked around, finally taking note of something very important to him. His eyes locked onto the beater. "And where is your alpha? I have a favor to return." He snarled violently. But in this moment, Drac and Vint attacked, hoping to catch him off guard. As if the Lycan ever had his guard up for them. They were not worth it. Merely a play toy. Because there was another wolf who held his interest now. In the second they moved, Lycarian stood to his full height. His eye burned with red flames and his 6-inch claws slashed into Vint who carelessly tried to grab one of arms. The force sent Vint soaring, knocking him unconscious on impact. Drac's hesitation caused him to gain the full attention of the furious Lycan. He could not escape as Lycarian all but sunk his claws into the wolf's body and viciously tore into him, ripping away flesh and bone, killing him instantly. Orst's ballistic growl could be heard over the fight. The sight of his best friend clouded his judgment as he went into a savage state. Ryan feeling helpless, as he couldn't stop Orst in charging in. He stood frozen as Lycarian also charged head onto the smaller wolf. Lycarian liked the crazed look in the smaller wolf's eyes. The two clashed, but the Lycan's heavy body gave him the advantage as he rolled over Orst. The heavy weight immobilized the werewolf, leaving him to the mercy of a wickedly grinning Lycan. "I am going to keep you alive," he told him, watching as confusion set in, but that did not extinguish the angry flames in Orst's eyes as he tried to bite him. Lycarian always liked those who took revenge. They were much more appealing to torture and kill. Orst struggled and fought as Lycarian bit down on his neck to suffocate him. The lack of oxygen to the brain forced Orst to fall limp. Lycarian dropped him without care, and then turned his attention to the one who was going to give him answers. "Well, aren't they just rude for interrupting us?" he said carkily and unhurriedly stalked to Ryan. The beater did not know what to do. His pride kept him from running, but his instincts and fear wanted him to bolt, knowing he couldn't win the fight alone. When Lycarian saw the decision in his eyes, he pounced and pinned the beater before he could retreat. Holding him by the neck, Ryan squirmed and grunted under his grip. Now where were we? He thought for a second, relishing the power he had over others. Oh yes, he tightened his grip and leaned his muzzle closer to Ryan's as his eyes turned into slits. Where is that alpha who dared to make me submit? He snarled intensely. When Ryan didn't respond, the Lycan added more pressure. Where is he? He roared. Right here. Chapter 29 Part 2 Right here. A voice invaded Lycarian's mind. When he turned his head, a sudden blur flew past his eyes and in the next second a heavy body was on his back and a tight grip on his neck. Lycarian roared and reared up, releasing Ryan from his death grip. The Lycan twisted and turned to fight off the wolf on his back, but he held on strongly. Ryan, after recovering, added in the attack and the two were able to tear Lycarian's wounds open before they could fully heal. Full of frustration and anger, Lycarian exploded. An invisible force of power burst out his body, and sent every wolf within a 5-meter radius airborne. But Lycarian's interest was immediately set on one wolf. However, it was not the one he wanted. Nolan struggled to get to his feet, but one of his back legs were twisted in an awkward and excruciating way. He had to escape as soon as possible because the moment the Lycan realized he was not Slade, he was dead for sure. Although it didn't matter if he died, he was still able to save one of his best friends. Lycarian's nose flared and lips curled as he eyed Nolan. His red eyes glared when the pathetic mutt shot him a crooked wolfish grin. He charged straight for the imposter. And that was more than enough. Lycarian reached Nolan, his teeth heading straight for his throat. But they never reached it. For the second time, Lycarian was interrupted. This time the grey figure was heavily built, as it smashed straight into the Lycan's side and sending him flying. The impact had Lycarian rolling to a stop as dirt and wolves were pushed out of the way. Astonished by the power, Lycarian stood up slowly to see who the culprit was. His fur bristled and muscles trembled in unadulterated fury, as his eyes connected with clouded green eyes. It was the very same eyes that he was forced to stare into as he kneeled before him. A low growl emitted deep within his chest. Alpha Slade stood proud as he defended his pack. Every werewolf recognized him, and all were relieved for him to return. They were being heavily beaten, especially since their leaders were out of the fight. The remaining Lycans and rogues slowly picking them off, their strategy long defeated. But now they had a chance. The sight of Slade sent a burst of energy into every wolf. Their attacks becoming quicker and more aggressive. There were two wolves in particular, who were more than relieved to see their friend. But it was Nolan who noticed the change in Slade. No longer did he have the light in his eyes. His body appearing stiff and tense. His attention solely on the Lycan. But the way he gazed at Lycarian could be one of complete and utter heartbreak. Because those red eyes once held an innocent and brave soul. But now it was lost in the sea of blood and darkness. Slade steeled his fragmented heart. His eyes misted black to hide his soul. He concentrated even harder to forget about Nine. Because he knew she was no longer there. And he would make sure she could never return to him. Slade was going to kill the Lycan and his beloved queen. Lycarian's head tilted in curiosity. It seemed the time away from Nine had changed the alpha. The beast was delighted to see the darkness creeping into his eyes. Ah, gotta love the things that can turn you into a monster. Lycarian darkly chuckled and stood to his two powerful legs, pleased at his supreme build. His head lifting high as his glistening eyes scrutinized the vengeful alpha. Come for revenge for your dear Nine? He asked conceitedly. But his keen sight noticed something different about the alpha. Almost primal. Animalistic. Lycarian felt his eyes gleam with pleasure. The alpha was barely holding onto his human side. He was allowing himself to turn full animal. One that followed his instincts for survival. Looks like this fight will be to the death. Lycarian reveled at the thought of finally fighting someone that was worth something. Let's see what you can do, Lycarian smirked. No, Slade snarled. I've come to avenge her. Pitch black eyes glared at blood red. And then Slade's lips curled into an uncharacteristically cruel smirk. Your eyes, they are above mine. Lycarian's eyes widened when he felt a blast of dizziness. His body wavered as a dense force pummeled him, sending him on all fours. His head hanging low as his thoughts wondered what just happened. When Lycarian saw large paws in front of him, excruciating slow, he lifted his eyes and there standing above him was a powerful and dominant alpha. Kneel. Slade's voice boomed like a crack of lightning, shaking the Lycan to his core. Slade showed no mercy as he spoke. You dare try to challenge me with this pitiful power? His lips curled in revulsion. Know your place, dog. A deep, scorching, fiery feeling built up in Lycarian's chest. The sensation had him trembling in hostility. Slowly he rose. The aura surrounding him turned lethal, deadly toxic. Like a drop of black ink in a glass filled with clear water, Lycarian's dominance tainted the air, spreading to every werewolf, rogue and Lycan until they felt the full effect of a pure alpha. They all collapsed to their knees, all except for one. Slade watched with growing concerns for the safety of the werewolves as the Lycan's eyes blacked over. His back arched grotesquely, saliva dripped from his gaping jaws as he released low snarls. He could see clearly as the Lycan transformed into his original being. His primal, ancient form. The true lycanthrope beast. In his purest state, his jagged fangs lengthened so much that it protruded out his sharp jaws peering like tusks. His obsidian eyes blended in with the onyx fur that also grew at an enormous rate. His body healing every open wound, pumping every muscle to its max limit, and strengthening the bones to withstand the Lycan's sudden growth in stature. The Goliath just barely held signs of Lycarian's unnaturally evolved development. He held on just enough to create speech. But everything else was running on pure primordial instincts. And as nature dictates, only the strongest survive. Slade bolted. His top priority was protecting the pack. Otherwise, they would all be at the mercy of the beast. Solid, black eyes followed the grey wolf intensely. Following the ancient calling, the Lycan sprang forward after the alpha who challenged him. His long legs easily eating up the distance. Once Slade noticed him following, he increased his speed. His sights set on the ruin upon the rocky cliff. Nothing but rocks and weeds lay rest there. He'd hope he would be far enough from the others so he could take down the Lycan once and for all. The hairs on his back alerted Slade to the nearness of Lycarian, just as he reached the entrance of the castle. With the beast right on his tail, Slade spotted a damaged pillar just ahead. With the right strength and timing, he could send it toppling hopefully on the Lycan to slow him down. It was worth the shot. Diverging his course, Slade timed himself to be just far enough from Lycarian. His muscles tensed as he ducked his head into his chest, ears flat against his head, and crashed into the side of the pillar. Rubble and dust flew, his head looked back, just in time to see his successful plan go into action. Smirking, Slade went into hiding in the large ruin. His prey a furious Lycan. Lycarian shook his head and body to rid of all the debris that fell on him. Growling in annoyance, he tried to sniff out the alpha. Only dust entered his sensitive nose, and he let out a loud sneeze. Not relying on his sense of smell, he opted to focus on vision and sound. On the unstable rocky ground and small twigs and vegetation growing, staying undetected was almost impossible. Prowling cautiously, the beast's ears twitched at every possible sound. Eyes diligently scanned the area. There was more than enough hiding spots, and one too many for Lycarian's patience. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now it was time for beasts to clash. Where there would be only one survivor. And one superior wolf. But it seemed one of them was making it difficult. Whereas Lycarian was more than ready for a bloody fight, the alpha was taking his time. Better fish him out. Scared, alpha. Lycarian reached the center of the ruin. The open area gave him a 360 view. Hearing movement to his left, he snapped his head there only to see dust spread from the second floor. His eyes carefully watched the shadows. Like your mate. An abrupt growl echoed loudly through the halls. Lycarian's ears just missing the pinpoint location of the angered wolf, as it ricocheted off the walls. The beast kept up his taunts, but it lacked his usual arrogance and sick pleasure. His sole mission was to bring out the elusive wolf. This time I made sure she would not interrupt us, he said, and could feel the animosity heighten in the air. Lycarian honed in on the spot just behind a cracked pillar, deep hidden in the shadows where he could feel the tension. He crouched low and bunched up his muscles. This time I made sure she stayed dead. And then he launched, propelling with extreme speed. With quick, precise movements, the Lycan lashed out behind the pillar only to cut open air. black eyes spotting a figure in the corner of his eyes just in the second Alpha Slade attacked. The two snarled and snapped as they clashed viciously, rolling and tumbling into fragmented walls and columns, smashing them to rocky bits. The fight was brutal. Clumps of fur were sprayed in the air as the claws dug deep, creating fatal wounds and gashes. The ground shook with every body crash and every powerful step. Just as they clashed, they pulled apart. Slade tried to show no pain, as his body healed much slower than the Lycan beast, he having no trouble with his critical injuries. While Slade's neck and spine were heavily injured, his wounds cleanly cut open, causing his muscles to twitch in pain. His face was no better. A deep gash marred his face, running from his head to down to his muzzle, cutting across his left eye. The blood was dripping down his face and blinding his one eye. Keeping his one eye closed, Slade and the Lycan circled each other. Blood dripped from Lycarian's injuries, tainting the floor red with the two wolves. But the Lycan kept his black orbs on the tiring Alpha. He wanted to play around with him, and what better way than slowly killing him? You doubt my supremacy? Then, I shall show you true power. An eerie black mist spread slowly out of the Lycan's paws. From beneath his feet, the vegetation crumbled and wilted to their deaths, spreading as the raw aura contaminated the air. The atmosphere was so toxic that Slade had himself backing up. His body trembled with the power surging through his body. His mind wavering in concentration, and his eyes rapidly blinking to keep an eye on his prey. Now you will feel what it's like to kneel before the one greater than you, Lycarian said, prowling towards Slade. With every step, the Alpha's legs shook with the weight of his dominance. The distance closed with Slade having his front legs spread apart, and head bowed low, but Lycarian stood tall and glared down at the one who challenged him. No longer will I play. It's time for you to die, Alpha. Lycarian's lips curled, revealing his tusk-like fangs protruding out of his mouth. In an instant, the Lycan's body pounced. His claws digging deep into soft flesh and teeth heading straight for the jugular. Lycarian's intentions were to kill. There was only going to be one survivor. Slade tried to fight back, but with the Lycan's enormous dominance surrounding him he could do little but to keep himself alive. Blood splattered. Howls rang out. Flesh teared open. And it all came from one dying wolf. Lycarian threw the exhausted Alpha to the ground. Slade, having lost everything, lay silently and unmoving. It was over. He would not win this. Black eyes slowly changed to green. With what little energy he had left, Slade shifted to his vulnerable, human form. Limbs spread wide and on his back, he watched the dark Lycarian creep closer. Slade did nothing as blood ran down his face and body. His muscles ached painfully with each breath he took. So many bones broken. And yet a smile graced his face. Guess this is it, 9. He coughed out. Sorry, I couldn't save you. Or anyone. He whispered, energy draining fast, so he closed his eyes and let the serene feeling wash over him. Lycarian placed his front claws on either side of the Alpha's head and leaned down slowly, eyes gleaming with bloodlust. Slade stared into the eyes of his killer. His last thoughts solely on his mate as memories flooded his mind. Times he spent with 9. Her scent. The feel whenever he was near her. Her innocent love. But just one last time. Come back to me, he thought pleadingly. Give me the strength to win. Slade closed his eyes. A single tear fell from the corners, trailed down his bruised and blooded face, just as Lycarian's jaws moved towards his neck and fangs piercing his tender skin. Give me the strength to live. Lycarian's eyes flickered for a mere second. But it was enough to halt his actions. For the first time, a moment of fear struck Lycarian's black heart. What? He suddenly felt a burning sensation deep within his chest. No. Impossible. The fire spread wildly, and then in the next second Lycarian could feel himself being dragged. But his body did not move an inch. Only his soul. No! He screamed and wildly thrashed as hand-like shadows wrapped around his spirit and pulled him away from his body vessel. He felt himself fall. Fear clearly laced his entire being that the Lycan himself shut his eyes to rid himself of the nightmare. And then it stopped. Heaving in lung full of air, Lycarian peeked through his lids and then opened them wide in panic. Because he knew where he was. He could not forget the dark place he lived in for 19 years. But this time the abyss was white. No longer was he standing in darkness. And no longer was he alone. There standing before him in a plain white dress a girl. She had an innocent smile on her face. Eyes unclouded and sincere, stared back into his red, panicked eyes. Lycarian abruptly roared and charged full force towards the girl. "You're supposed to be dead," he boomed as his Lycan body pounced. But two massive, gold and white werewolves intercepted his path. He thought he could easily take them down, but his instincts were begging him to retreat. Something he never experienced before. Lycarian came to a sudden halt when a blinding ray of light shone from behind Nine and ridding him of his vision. The Lycan hissed in pain and back up as the light receded. Whipping his head to the girl, he all but snarled viciously whilst keeping his distance. "I see you still hate me." Nine spoke, her voice soft and tender as she smiled at him. Blinking her silver eyes, she peered at the white ground in bashfulness. "I want to thank you, Lycarian," she said and looked up. Lycarian, watching her with cautious eyes. Ears flicking and tail swishing anxiously. When he didn't answer, Nine replied. "If it wasn't for you then," a grin curled her lips, as she paused to look to the suddenly appearing hand that placed lightly on her shoulder. A person formed behind her and took their place next to Nine. Nine's eyes softened as she gazed at them. "Then, I wouldn't have met my mother." Eleanor Steele gracefully smiled down at her daughter, and then turned to the shocked Lycan, and nodded her head in greeting. Similar to her daughter, Eleanor was dressed in a beautiful white gown, but decorated in with gems and diamonds as fitted for a royal. Nine smiles at her mother. "It's okay. This is my fight." "As you wish, my daughter," Eleanor said and placed a single kiss to Nine's head. She was proud of her daughter and allowed her to step away from the protection of the golden wolves to face the very creature she lost her husband to. Nine puffed out her chest and curled her fists. Eyes unwavering and her mind firmly set, as she said loud and clear. "Lycarian, I challenge you for dominance." The action had Lycarian relaxing. His body eased as he took everything in. For him, the challenge was a joke. The girl was a joke. Like she could ever defeat him. A Lycan. The original beast to walk the land. And yet, his instincts were growing with every passing second. Begging him to submit on command. "Why? You?" He mopped and lifted his head in arrogance. "What could you possibly do? Without me you are nothing," he snarled. "And without me, you wouldn't have existed." Nine said back. A tiny, noticeable smirk curled her lips. "You are my wolf as I am your human." Lycarian bristled. "You should worry more about yourself, because after we are through there will only be one in control. And I can assure you," Nine's eyes flickered brightly for a second. "It won't be you, Lycarian." The beast's chest heaved. Red eyes narrowing into slits and low growls emitted deep within his throat. "Fine. Let's settle this once and for all." He snapped and dug his claws into the ground for traction, and launched himself at the girl. But Nine did not move an inch. Instead she waited and allowed her prey come to her. Lycarian's long legs ate up the distance. Once he was meters away, he roared and leapt towards Nine. His jaws were wide open and prepared to end a tenacious life. Meanwhile, 9 was prepared. For her, the movements slowed. Her senses heightened, taking in every detail. From Lycan's oncoming attack to her hands moving swiftly through the air to curl around the beast's jaws and bringing his head to press against her torso. His neck arched as his body hurled forward by the force of his jump, but 9's body was like a sturdy wall that did not allow him to push her back and held firm into place. Time snapped back into action. Lycan's eyes dilated in panic at the sudden strength the girl possessed. Breathing heavily, the beast seemed to freeze. 9 grinned at his astonishment. "Let me show you the power of a royal werewolf." 9 began to tremble. A familiar sensation took over as bones cracked and snapped. Her body took the change in stride, black and white fur seeped out from her skin, hands and feet shifting into paws, as she stood just as tall as the Lycan on all fours and emitted the same amount of pressure and aura as that of the beast. Lycan felt himself stare at the wolf he could have been before the Lycan DNA changed his being. He would have been like the others, but instead of pure black, the wolf had mix of pure white fur. Neither shades blend with the other but stood out separately. "Did you know, Lycan," 9 said through the link, "that the moon goddess has given me a second chance in life and a second chance with my own wolf?" The Lycan snapped his eyes to her, red orbs flickering in terror. 9 noticed his fears and nodded her head. "Yes. It means you will no longer walk the earth, and you will forever stay in darkness." "No. I refuse to allow that." Lycan growled aggressively, but he could not hide his nervousness. "You have no choice." And just like that, the conversations were over as 9's golden eyes shifted along with her deadly intentions. She left him no room as she charged him. Lycan, caught off guard, howled in pain as 9's teeth dug deep. He too lashed out in desperation, because finally he found someone worthy to be his opponent. Someone who could show him true pain. And someone who could end his life. Lycan's movements became sloppy as his anxiety grew, while 9 moved as if she was one with her wolf. Each time the Lycan attacked, the royal would easily dodge and create a lethal wound. It was hard to believe, the great and arrogant Lycan was losing to the mere human he mocked and taunted. How the tables have turned. The beast weakened. His legs shook under his weight, as his head stayed low, breathing in deeply. "How?" he asked pitifully. "How are you stronger than me?" His knees buckled as his back legs collapsed, but front legs stayed firm. "I am the original creation. I am more powerful than you," he snarled. His stubbornness was the only thing holding him up, as his body had enough. 9 shifted to her human form, the dress seeming to never have left through the shift. She lifted her head in a sign of dominance and authority. Her eyes reflected her emotions. Emotions that a Lycan would not understand. Her voice was calm but strong. "It's because you underestimate humans. You think we are inferior to you just because we don't not possess the strength you do. You think our emotions are weak, that our feelings to protect others are worthless." She shook her head and eyes narrowed. "But you are wrong, Lycan. Us humans have something worth fighting for. I have something to fight for." 9 took a deep, steady breath. "You who only fights for himself, but I fight for every werewolf I killed, every family I destroyed." Though her voice was low, but it was thick with emotion. "But most of all, I'm fighting for the ones that are still alive." 9 puffed out her chest and straightened her back. "I'm fighting for my family. For my friends. And for every werewolf that you are going to kill." She said powerfully, "I'm fighting for them, and that is what is making me stronger than you." Lycan crumbled. His body involuntarily curling into a submissive position, as he peered almost shyly up at 9. 9 lightly chuckled, though it was dark and humorless. A trait she picked up from the beast. She walked towards him and crouched to his eye level, amused when he did not look her in the eyes. Besides, you're a defect. You may think you have the true power of a Lycan, but you don't. You're a half-breed. A Lycan and a werewolf. 9 smirked cruelly at him. You don't have the full potential of either one, so how could you possibly win against me? A royal blessed by the moon goddess herself. It's like you said, Lycarian. She said wickedly. Only the strongest survive. And like that, everything went dark for the Lycan, as he returned to the place he belonged. The fighting ceased. The rogues under the control of the Lycan snapped back to reality. Their eyes cleared and so did their submissive behavior. The werewolves watched as the rogues suddenly made a dash for the woods. Their retreat sent shock waves of confusion, but also excitement. Even the remaining Lycans chose to escape, leaving behind dead bodies and a lone wolf, by the name of Victor Bane. What's happening? He watched with wide, bewildered eyes as his army disbanded. Deserted by his creations, Victor stumbled backwards, his eyes narrowing with hate and rage as his nose flared. Without a word, he turned around and escaped into the woods. During the confusion, the werewolves were distracted by their win. Many rejoiced at their victory, but there were a few who were silent. A few pair of eyes looked to the ruined castle with despair. It was the councilman and Slade's pack who knew the reason they had won. Slade had killed the Lycan. Killed his mate. A sense of sorrow and defeat fell upon those who knew the truth. But the sacrifice needed to be made. And now, to rebuild what Victor had destroyed. Tian, who was held up by fellow warriors, commanded attention from the werewolves, even though his legs no longer moved. It is not time to celebrate. His voice boomed. Victor has fled. Those able to still fight go and find Victor, and bring him back to face justice. A handful of warriors took it upon themselves to track down the enemy, as they fled after Victor. The rest helped the survivors. He yelled and winced when a shot of pain surged through his upper body. The Lycan had rendered him a paraplegic. Tian could not feel anything below his waist and knew the damage could not be repaired. He knew he had to step down from his position. But as he gazed to his fellow councilman Vint being whisked away to the healer, and Orst, mourning his lost friend, he knew that in some ways, Victor had won. Had proven that his creation could have possibly ended the werewolf existence. But it was not this day. Beta Ryan and Omega Nolan. He called out as he watched over the clearing. The 2 wolves appeared. They said no words as they could not bring themselves to. Tian looked to them and said, "Go with the healer and find your alpha. Make sure he is all right." The pair nodded and Tian watched them head towards the hill. Tian could only silently thank Alpha Slade. If it weren't for him, they would all be dead. Slade's eyes opened. He waited for the final attack, but was greeted with eerie silence. As his eyes adjusted, they dilated at the sight of sharp, jagged teeth inches away from him. He'd become more aware that the Lycan was frozen above him. Suddenly there was a light, warm sensation building inside of him. His eyes blinked wildly at the unexpected gold light coming from above the Lycan's head. It fell upon them like a halo. His critical wounds that would surely killed him were healing. It did not hurt or sting. It felt like a brush of a feather gently caressing his body, searching for injuries and then healing them. What's going on? He thought. His heart skipped a beat for just a second as he looked into the Lycan's eyes. Slade could recognize when 9 would talk to the Lycan. He gasped and green eyes enlarged with hope. 9. He whispered. He dared not to touch her but dared to hope for her return. The Lycan's eyes flickered red and black. There? Slade's thoughts exclaimed as he saw it. The light? A sharp ray of white entered the eyes like a beacon. Come on 9. He silently cheered on. Watching with anxiousness. Then the eyes turned pitch black and Slade held his breath. Time ticked by excruciatingly slow before the Lycan began to shake. The fur bristled as the muscles twitched. The first bone snapped. And then another. Soon the whole body was shifting. Midnight fur receded into the skin. The tail and ears disappeared as the bones shifted and changed as the transformation took place. Little by little, Slade watched with unease and nervousness. His eyes solely on the Lycans, watching with intense emotion, as the black faded out and replaced with a silvery glow. 9. He said breathlessly. Tears prickled the corner of his eyes as it leaked out the side of his face. A large grin curled his lips, and his heat beating loudly in his chest. No amount of pain could stop Slade from slowly lifting his hands and cupping his mate's cheeks. 9. He repeated, 9, my beautiful mate. Breathing heavily, 9 let out a shaky smile. Her arms were too weak to hold herself up, so she collapsed on her bare mate. Slade. Her voice croaked with emotion, snuggling into his warm chest even though he was stained red. And like that, Slade cried out in euphoria. His arms wrapped around her bare back, as he shouted in pure happiness, until his voice became hoarse and husky. Slade rolled them both to the side, so he could hold his mate close while gazing at her, as if she were a dream. 9 leant her head on his left arm and smiled. She was still the same, nothing had changed except for her silver eyes. She was still beautiful and still his queen. Slade caressed her cheek with his thumb, trailing it down to her lips. I knew you would defeat him, he whispered with a small smile. 9's eyes half closed and a little smirk graced her face as she leaned closer. Sorry I took so long. Now it was Slade's turn to smirk, her lips brushing against his. I'll forgive you, but you have to make up for lost time, he said, and then kissed her passionately. The couple put all their emotions into it. Their happiness, their longing, their yearning for the other. They barely took a breath, barely separated for fear of each other disappearing. They had gone through so much. But now they were together. For always. Suddenly, out of nowhere a high-pitched scream rang out through the ruin. The screech had the couple parting and on high alert, honing in on the sound. But what met their eyes were 2 men in their human form. One stunned into silence as his jaw dropped, while the other was cupping his cheeks and letting out incomprehensible screeches that sounded awfully like 9's name. The couple relaxed when they saw Nolan dropping dramatically to his knees, tears freely running down his face, as he cried happily into his hands. Even Ryan had a forearm covering his eyes, as he held his head back to stop the tears from falling. He quickly composed himself and grabbed Nolan and pulled him up. He waved at his Alpha and Luna, and then dragged a wailing Omega out the way they came, leaving them to enjoy each other's presence for a little longer. 9 and Slade laughed at their friends, then turned to gaze into each other's eyes. You'll never leave me, right? He asked. 9 nodded her head and smiled cutely. Never. The couple finally met up with their friends outside the ruin. Nolan and Ryan reacting quickly to the sight of their Luna. And after prying Nolan off 9, they finally got down to business. 9 was briefed about what had occurred when she was gone. About the war, the other Lycans and Victor escaping. Let him go, she said. What? The men simultaneously said. 9 looked to Slade. Call back the warriors. We don't have to worry about him anymore. Slade's brows fell. Are you sure? He asked, and 9 nodded. She looked to the view from the cliff side and smirked. Yeah, he'll get what he deserves, she said distractedly. Her eyes flickering black for a moment. Victor heaved in deeply and came to a stop. He looked back, using his heightened senses to detect if the trackers were close by. Even though his wolf was improved by the Lycan DNA, he had some side effects. One being, his body could not withstand the added muscle mass and rapid metabolism, so he easily tired. But it gave him the time to think about his failure. He growled savagely, the sound scaring nearby birds as they fluttered away from the danger. Deep in the woods, Victor could only pace in his anger. His mind wandered to what could have gone wrong. It wasn't possible for the werewolves to win. Something must have been miscalculated with his creations. No matter, he thought. He was still alive. He would start over. First he needed to find his precious creations, and then he would evolve them to control the power and this time, be under his command. Mind set and clear, Victor internally smirked and slowly began to walk. But as he did, he noticed a change in the woods. It was silent. No birds, no scurrying insects, no wind. The trees stood still and a dark cloud covered the sun, creating darkness over the land. It didn't feel right. Victor's instincts were on high guard, telling him that something was coming. Alone, a cold chill rang through his spine as his fur stood on end and ears twitching to pick up any sound. A movement to his left caught his eyes. He snapped around only to back up in fear. Out from the shadows came a glow. The silvery white shone brightly, as it slowly moved out of the trees and into the full view of Victor. Eleanor. He gasped in astonishment. The royal queen and his mate lightly nodded her head in greeting, but there was no expression on her beautiful face, as she gazed back to the man she once loved. "Hello, Victor," she said, the sound of her voice sending shock waves through Victor's body. "You're dead?" he stammered, eyes not believing what he was seeing. But there she was in an ivory gown, standing gracefully, as she gazed at him with steady eyes. "I am," Eleanor said softly, her head lowering as she thought of why she died. Then it sparked with a simmering flame filled with bitter emotions. Like a queen, she raised her head and straightened her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. "I have come to create peace for all werewolves on this earth." She started, "And to do that, I must get rid of you." Victor could only stare at his mate. "You know, I've always loved you," she said with sorrow. Her gentle eyes trailing to the ground because she could not look at the man she loved. It was too painful. "I have waited, prayed that you would lose interest in those beasts and that one day, you would come back to me. Be the gentleman I used to know." Finally, Eleanor could speak the words she held in all this time. They haunted her as time passed, wishing she could have a second chance. And now she did. But it was going to heal and break her for what she was about to do. She ignored her heart, and her eyes turned cold. "The moon goddess will not let you live. You will die right here, Victor," she said icily. The wind suddenly picked up a chilling breeze, shaking the trees as a sudden amount of pressure surrounded the two. Although Victor was the only feeling the effects. What's going on?" he exclaimed and looked around him. Rustling alerted him to the oncoming threat, hidden in the shadows. "Eleanor!" he shouted at her in dread. But Eleanor no longer listened to him. "You will die by the very thing you loved more." She spoke, just as the beast stepped out from the woods growling and snapping at a terrified Victor. They circled him like prey. "This is my final goodbye, Victor. We will never meet again here or in the afterlife." Eleanor turned her back on him, closed her eyes and took a deep breath. That's when the Lycans attacked both by his remaining creations and those who walked the earth. "Eleanor!" Victor cried out as he was savagely tiered. Each Lycan vying for a large chunk of the prey, their dominance not allowing others to be above them. The woods rang out with vicious growls and sounds of bones cracking and skin stretching. Eleanor could hear it all. The last of his cries. Slowly she reopened her eyes, everything became clear to her. No longer did she feel the heavy burden placed in her heart. She was free. And with that, she disappeared from this world. Epilogue. 9 sighed contentedly and gazed out into the open sea from the top deck. the waves barely jostling the massive cruise ship. After the war, much was to be done in restoring what Victor had damaged. But the first problem to be dealt with was Nine herself. She was still considered a threat to the werewolf community. But it seemed that one more gift was bestowed on her. As the last werewolf to have the royal blood, Nine was protected by law. No harm was to become of her, even though many argued. What was left of the council had agreed that she was to stay alive. But she was not to be part of the council, or take any part in werewolf affairs. Some packs had put the blame on her, and would rebel if Nine were to join the council. But the moment she stepped out of line, or showed signs of becoming a Lycan, she would be destroyed by all means. But she didn't care. Nine only wanted to be with Slade and her family. That's all she needed. And with that, she was let free to do what she wants. And that was learn new things. Slade suggested to travel. The destination everywhere possible. Nine was so stoked to see the world. They'd already been to many countries, seen so many cultures, and experienced new things. It was so much more than Nine could imagine. Isn't that right, Dex? She whispered and looked to the sky. The sun slowly disappearing into the horizon. You see me, Dex. I'm finally living my life. Nine grinned so widely. I'll learn so many things and I'll never stop learning. She told him, the wind around her picking up and making her laugh into the wind. Nine sobered up. Her grin softening, and eyes gazing distractedly into the blue waters. And one day, I will teach you everything I know. Just like how you taught me. She whispered tenderly. Her eyes then looked back to the sunset. But until then, I'll miss you. Thank you for everything you have done for me, my friend. She smiled. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind and pulled her flush against a warm chest. Nine tilted her head to gaze at Slade. He looked as handsome as ever. The scars on his face from the battle with the Lycan did nothing to deter Nine away. He loved her for her scars and she would love him for his. What has got my wife so down? Slade asked, his hands finding hers as he played with the ring on her finger. It's been years since they got married and still he acted like a love-sick fool. Even if Nine was no longer his mate. Slade still loved Nine as if the bond never broke. His heart and soul was hers and nothing could ever break that. But it was also because of the broken connection that Slade realized that the mating pool was a lie. From the time of the first werewolf, it was believed that mates were together because of the bond created by the moon goddess, but it was untrue. The moon goddess had blessed each wolf to find their true love, but under the pretense of the mating pool, every soulmate failed to realize that they were the ones to keep the love going. The pool barely had anything to do with it. It was the love for the other that made soulmates accept every part of their mates. The good, the bad and the evil. Slade closed his eyes and pulled Nine even closer, tightening his hold on her and leaning his chin on her shoulder. Yeah. They didn't need the mating pool to keep them together. Knowing Nine was the only one for him was enough for Slade. And he'd fight tooth and nail to keep her close. Nine, sensing a change in her husband, laid a kiss to his rough cheek. Just thinking about Dexter, and how I'm going to tell him about how a ship works. She told him and Slade chuckled, lifting his head to gaze into her silvery grey eyes. It's a good thing Dexter has incredible patience, because he's damn well gonna need it. He said, loving his wife's innocence. These amazing moments is what he missed out for too long. It was because of her that Slade decided to step down as alpha of his pack. He wanted to spend every second by her side. He was going to keep his promise to show Nine the world. To give her everything she wanted. And that's why he gave up the title, who now belonged to a very surprised Beta. His best friend was more than stunned when he heard Slade's words. But Slade could only smile at him. Ryan was more than fit to be alpha, and his little sister would surely cause trouble, but maybe being a Luna would teach her about patience and gentle compassion, which she clearly lacks. Either way, Slade was done. He had thought about it long and hard in the time he ran away before the war. If he and Nine survived, then he would spend time only with her. No longer would pack affairs stop their time together. Besides, Slade could not go through another soul-shattering moment, as when Tian commanded him to kill his mate. He did remember that Ryan offered to take control until he returns, but Slade refused. He was going to live a comfortable life with his wife and in time, maybe have a few extra feet running around the house. Yeah, that's the life for me, Slade whispered heartedly. The soulmates watched the sun quietly disappear, the last of the light fading away, and bring out the black night. Your human emotions sicken me. Lycarian's voice interrupting, made Nine smile. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Slade peering down her in curiosity, but he too smiled when he knew where she was going. Opening her eyes, Nine could see her wolf sulking, which made her smile widen. Seeing her happiness, Lycarian stood to his full height, but that no longer intimidated Nine. I will wait, he snarled. You humans cannot stay strong for long. You will always fall, and when you do, I will not hesitate to take full control. Nine peered at him with patience. Even after so long, Lycarian still fought her. She admired his fighting spirit, but that only made her try harder. The moon goddess allowed the Lycan to be Nine's wolf on her request. She wanted to show Lycarian the world. He had been with her every step of the way. Made sure she survived, gave her the strength to fight. And now she would return the favor. But that's okay, because you know why, Lycarian, she said, piquing his attention. As I grow older, I will learn and experience so much. I will go through this world with unclouded eyes, and that will make me grow and become stronger. Then Nine grinned. But there will be a time when we will separate. Lycarian perks up in eagerness. Nine walks towards him. She knows his stubbornness is what kept him from moving away. She gently smiles at him. It will be through death. Nine reaches up and lays a hand on his head. She slowly caresses his midnight fur, his blood, red eyes staring impassively at her. But even so, no matter how much you hate me, we will always be together. Her eyes trail to his, where he could see every emotion in her unguarded eyes. Nine whispers finally, together we'll see new things. Together we will move on from the arena, and together we'll finally be free. The end. Be part of our werewolf community. Subscribe.